August 2nd, 1980, the height of the Italian summer. The city of Bologna is a vital, beating artery in the geographical and economic heart of the country. Its central railway station is teeming with an overwhelming tide of humanity. It is the first weekend of August, a period traditionally dedicated to the mass exodus of families leaving the suffocating heat of the cities for the coastal beaches and the mountains. The platforms are crowded with tourists, students, and workers. The second-class waiting room, situated in the west wing of the main building, is packed beyond capacity. People are reading newspapers, children are resting on luggage, and the ambient noise is a chaotic symphony of train announcements, departing engines, and overlapping conversations. The large analog clock on the station's main facade steadily ticks toward mid-morning. At exactly 10:25, the illusion of a normal, peaceful summer day is instantaneously and permanently annihilated. A devastating, blinding flash of white light consumes the waiting room, followed by a catastrophic pressure wave that defies the boundaries of human comprehension. In a fraction of a second, the bustling transit hub is transformed into a landscape of absolute, apocalyptic ruin. The hands of the main station clock stop moving, permanently frozen at 10:25, becoming the iconic, silent monument to the darkest day in the history of the Italian Republic. Before we navigate the suffocating dust of the collapsed station and begin to decode the labyrinth of political terrorism and state secrets that orchestrated this massacre, ensure your clearance to this archive is active. Subscribe to the ItaliaNoir channel and leave a like on this dossier. Your support is the vital instrument that allows us to expose the hidden architecture of these clandestine crimes and bring forgotten truths into the light. Let us step back into the labyrinth. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was not characterized by screams, but by a terrifying, absolute silence. The sheer concussive force of the blast had temporarily deafened the survivors, plunging the epicenter into a vacuum of sensory deprivation. Then, the immense cloud of pulverized concrete, plaster, and shattered glass began to settle, and the true, devastating scale of the attack was revealed. The entire west wing of the station building had simply ceased to exist. The roof had collapsed inward, crushing the waiting room and the adjacent offices under thousands of tons of structural debris. The shock wave was so immense that it tore through the station's infrastructure, striking the Ancona to Chiasso regional train that was waiting on the first platform, tearing the carriages apart as if they were made of fragile paper. The blast radius extended outward, shattering windows miles away and shaking the very foundations of the medieval city. Within minutes, the paralyzing shock mutated into a frantic, desperate mobilization. The citizens of Bologna did not wait for the official emergency services to coordinate a response. An army of ordinary people, covered in a thick layer of gray, toxic dust, rushed towards the epicenter of the collapse. They began to dig through the massive concrete slabs and the twisted metal with their bare hands, tearing at the rubble in a desperate race against time to pull the survivors from the suffocating darkness. The official ambulance fleet was instantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of casualties. In a spontaneous act of civic resilience, the city commandeered public transportation. The city bus number 37, stripped of its normal civilian purpose, was transformed into a makeshift medical transport, its floorboards bearing the heavy crimson testament of the morning's horror as it navigated the chaotic streets toward the local hospitals. The devastation was absolute. 85 people lost their lives in the blast, their futures stolen in a cowardly, faceless act of violence. Over 200 others sustained severe, life-altering injuries. The victims were not political targets. They were not military personnel or figures of institutional power. They were families heading on vacation, young students traveling across Europe, ordinary citizens whose only mistake was standing in a specific waiting room on a Saturday morning. This was not a targeted assassination. It was indiscriminate, blind slaughter designed to maximize the psychological trauma inflicted upon the entire nation. It was an attack on the fundamental concept of public safety, a message written in fire and debris that no one, anywhere, was truly secure. To understand the profound gravity of this massacre, it is essential to contextualize the geopolitical temperature of Italy in 1980. The nation was navigating the treacherous waters of the years of lead, a prolonged era of severe socio-political turmoil defined by extreme ideological violence. The country was caught in a brutal crossfire between radical left-wing paramilitary organizations and deeply entrenched right-wing neo-fascist militant groups. Assassinations, kidnappings, and bombings were frequent, terrifying occurrences. However, the Bologna Massacre represented a terrifying escalation, a paradigm shift in the rules of engagement. Bologna was not a random choice. It was the historical capital of the Italian left, a city with a fierce, proud tradition of anti-fascism. Striking Bologna was a highly symbolic, calculated act of war, designed to destabilize the democratic institutions and push the fragile republic toward the precipice of an authoritarian crisis. In the chaotic, immediate hours following the explosion, the authorities were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. The initial communications released to the desperate, terrified public were defined by an almost willful denial of reality. Early reports suggested that the explosion was the result of a catastrophic structural failure, specifically the accidental explosion of a massive, antiquated boiler located in the station's basement. It was a comforting, technical lie, a desperate attempt to frame the tragedy as a tragic accident rather than a deliberate act of war. But this narrative could not survive the mounting forensic evidence. As the fire brigades and the explosive ordnance disposal units sifted through the massive crater in the center of the waiting room, the unmistakable, acrid scent of military-grade explosives lingered in the dust. The structural damage was not consistent with a pressurized boiler. It was the undeniable signature of a highly sophisticated, high-yield bomb. By the late afternoon, the tragic truth was officially confirmed to a paralyzed nation. The crater had been caused by an improvised explosive device, a deadly mixture of TNT and T4, weighing approximately 23 kilograms, deliberately placed in an abandoned suitcase just inches from the load-bearing wall of the waiting room. The timer had been set with cold, sociopathic precision to detonate at the exact moment the station reached its maximum human capacity. The confirmation of a terrorist attack sent a shockwave of rage and profound vulnerability throughout the Italian peninsula. The grief was instantaneous, but the demand for justice, for a clear identification of the architects behind the slaughter, became an overwhelming roar. The investigation that launched from the smoking ruins of the Bologna railway station would quickly prove to be one of the most complex, obstructed, and deeply frustrating judicial processes in modern European history. The authorities were not simply hunting a lone, radicalized bomber. The sophistication of the explosive device, the strategic choice of the target, and the flawless execution of the attack suggested a level of operational capacity that went far beyond the reach of a small, isolated militant cell. The investigators were stepping into a labyrinth of shadows, where the lines between political extremism, organized crime, and the clandestine corridors of state intelligence were deliberately, maliciously blurred. As the dust settled over the devastated city, the political establishment scrambled to provide answers. But the initial investigative momentum was immediately compromised by a series of bizarre anomalies and calculated misdirections. False leads were mysteriously generated. Anonymous phone calls flooded the police switchboards, claiming responsibility on behalf of fictitious or defunct political groups, and crucial pieces of physical evidence seemed to vanish or lose their chain of custody. It became terrifyingly apparent that there were powerful, invisible forces at play, entities operating from the highest echelons of power, who possessed a vested interest in ensuring that the true architects of the Bologna Massacre remained permanently hidden in the dark. The citizens of Bologna, still burying their dead and tending to the hundreds of wounded, realized they were fighting a war on two fronts. They were fighting the trauma of the physical attack, and they were beginning a decades-long battle against an invisible, institutional wall of silence. The bomb at 10:25 did not just destroy a railway station, it blew open a terrifying window into the strategy of tension, a clandestine geopolitical doctrine designed to manipulate public fear to maintain political control. The search for the phantom bombers of August 2nd would require the investigators to look beyond the radical fringes of society and turn their gaze toward the untouchable, classified heart of the Italian deep state. The true nightmare of Bologna had only just begun. The immediate aftermath of the Bologna Massacre was a period defined by a profound, agonizing dissonance. As the nation observed a day of collective mourning, and the funerals of the 85 victims were broadcast across a paralyzed peninsula, the investigative apparatus of the Italian state began to experience a series of bizarre, inexplicable malfunctions. The crater in the second-class waiting room was still smoking, the air heavy with the acrid stench of pulverized concrete and high explosives. Yet the primary focus of the authorities seemed strangely disjointed from the physical reality of the crime scene. The pressure to provide immediate answers to a terrified, furious public was immense, but the trajectory of the initial inquiries appeared to be guided by an invisible, predetermined script rather than the objective analysis of forensic evidence. The search for truth was being actively, maliciously replaced by the manufacture of a convenient narrative. Before we decode the complex, deliberate architecture of the cover-up and examine the clandestine forces that actively manipulated the pursuit of justice, ensure your clearance to this archive is active. Subscribe to the ItaliaNoir channel and leave a like on this dossier. Your support is the vital instrument that allows us to expose the hidden architecture of these clandestine crimes and bring forgotten truths into the light. Let us step back into the labyrinth. In the crucial hours and days following August 2nd, the investigation was flooded with a chaotic torrent of misinformation. Anonymous phone calls from various European cities claimed responsibility on behalf of radical left-wing organizations, specifically targeting groups that were already under intense public and political scrutiny. These initial, highly publicized leads were swiftly disseminated by segments of the press, creating a powerful, immediate association in the public consciousness between the massacre and the extreme left. However, these claims were almost instantly recognized as sophisticated fabrications by the more astute counterterrorism units. The operational signature of the bombing, the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians in a highly symbolic, public space, was entirely inconsistent with the targeted political assassinations characteristic of the left-wing paramilitaries of the era. The methodology of the Bologna attack belonged to a different, far more sinister doctrine. The true nature of the bombing pointed inexorably toward the radical right wing, specifically the neo-fascist militant networks that operated with a terrifying degree of impunity during the years of lead. These groups adhered to a philosophy of systemic destabilization, utilizing mass casualty events to cultivate an atmosphere of absolute terror and institutional crisis, theoretically paving the way for an authoritarian intervention. As the investigators slowly began to pivot their focus toward the extreme right, specifically targeting a violent, subversive organization known as the Armed Revolutionary Nuclei, or NAR, the invisible wall of institutional obstruction suddenly materialized. The deeper the magistrates dug into the connections between the neo-fascist bombers and their potential logistical support networks, the more frequently vital intelligence was mislaid, delayed, or deliberately altered. The investigation was facing an organized, systemic sabotage. The most blatant and consequential manifestation of this interference occurred in January 1981, a few months after the massacre. A suitcase was mysteriously discovered on a train traveling from Taranto to Milan, containing high explosives, perfectly matching the chemical composition of the bomb detonated in Bologna. Alongside the explosives were various documents, weapons, and items specifically designed to implicate foreign terrorists and a left-wing militant. It was a sophisticated, cinematic setup, a false flag operation intended to permanently derail the magistrate's focus away from the domestic neo-fascist networks. This event, later known as the Toronto train diversion, was not the desperate act of isolated criminals trying to cover their tracks. It was a highly coordinated operation that required significant logistical resources, secure access to transit routes, and, most terrifyingly, access to classified explosive materials. The architects of this diversion were not common thugs. They were high-ranking officials within the Italian military intelligence agency itself. The revelation that the very institutions tasked with protecting the state were actively protecting the perpetrators of its deadliest massacre sent a seismic shockwave through the democratic foundations of the Republic. The investigators were no longer just hunting the individuals who had placed the bomb. They were forced to confront a clandestine network of power operating within the shadows of the government. This network was identified as the Propaganda Due, or P2 Masonic Lodge, a secret, subversive organization composed of prominent politicians, military generals, media magnates, and intelligence directors. The P2 Lodge operated as a parallel state, manipulating national policy and controlling vast segments of the institutional apparatus to achieve its own reactionary, anti-democratic agenda. Their involvement in the misdirection of the Bologna investigation was a critical component of the strategy of tension. By shielding the neo-fascist executioners and deliberately confusing the public narrative, they sought to maintain the atmosphere of fear and instability that justified their own accumulation of clandestine power. The magistrates investigating the massacre found themselves navigating a minefield of classified secrets, facing constant bureaucratic resistance and subtle intimidation from figures occupying the highest echelons of authority. The pursuit of justice for the 85 victims of Bologna had evolved into a direct, perilous confrontation with the deep state. Despite the monumental, orchestrated cover-up, the relentless persistence of a small group of dedicated magistrates slowly began to dismantle the architecture of the deception. They meticulously traced the logistical origins of the explosives, analyzed the movements of known neo-fascist operatives in the days preceding the attack, and painstakingly deconstructed the false narratives planted by the corrupted intelligence officers. The focus narrowed definitively on the armed revolutionary nuclei, specifically highlighting the prominent roles of Valerio Fioravanti and Francesca Mambro, two of the most ruthless and ideologically committed figures within the neo-fascist underground. They were individuals completely detached from any conventional moral framework, operating with a terrifying, nihilistic dedication to their subversive cause. Fioravanti and Mambro, along with other members of their militant cell, were eventually apprehended following a series of violent, unrelated shootouts with law enforcement. Their capture did not yield immediate confessions or a clear, transparent account of the Bologna bombing. Instead, it marked the beginning of a grueling, decades-long judicial battle characterized by constant appeals, conflicting testimonies, and the persistent, suffocating influence of the institutional cover-up. The trial process was a labyrinthine marathon that tested the endurance of the Italian legal system and the resilience of the victims' families, who had organized into a powerful association demanding total transparency and uncompromising justice. The courtroom proceedings offered a chilling glimpse into the psychology of the perpetrators. Fioravanti and Mambro, while eventually convicted of numerous other assassinations and acts of terrorism, steadfastly maintained their innocence regarding the Bologna massacre. They presented themselves as ideological warriors, claiming that the indiscriminate, blind slaughter of civilians at a railway station contradicted their specific, targeted methodology of political violence. However, the accumulated weight of circumstantial evidence, witness testimonies placing them near the station, and their undeniable connections to the logistical networks that provided the explosives ultimately convinced the judiciary of their guilt. They were sentenced to multiple life terms, a verdict that provided a measure of legal accountability, but left profound, enduring questions unanswered. The conviction of the material executors of the massacre did not satisfy the public's demand for the complete truth. The identity of the individuals who actually carried the suitcase into the waiting room was only a fragment of the horrific puzzle. The more terrifying, unresolved reality was the identity of the mandanti, the political and institutional architects who had ordered, financed, and subsequently protected the bombers. The trial had successfully prosecuted the soldiers of the neo-fascist terror network, but the generals, the clandestine figures operating within the P2 Lodge, and the corrupted intelligence agencies largely evaded definitive judicial reckoning for their role in the massacre. The narrative of Bologna remained incomplete, a gaping wound in the historical memory of the nation. The legacy of the Bologna massacre is a complex, painful testament to the fragility of democratic institutions when confronted by the invisible forces of the deep state. It is a story of absolute, devastating loss, but it is also a narrative of extraordinary civic resilience. The families of the victims, refusing to be silenced by the systemic obstruction, transformed their grief into a relentless, decades-long campaign for truth. They became the moral conscience of the investigation, constantly demanding the declassification of state secrets and challenging the official narratives manufactured to protect the powerful. Their unwavering persistence ensured that the bombing at 10:25 remained at the forefront of the national dialogue, a constant reminder that true justice is a fragile concept that requires constant, vigilant defense against the shadows of political manipulation. The bomb destroyed the station, but it could not extinguish the profound, enduring demand for the complete, unvarnished truth. The pursuit of absolute truth in the aftermath of the Bologna massacre was not a sprint. It was a grueling, multi-generational marathon against an adversary that possessed the entire apparatus of the state at its disposal. For the families of the 85 victims and the hundreds of survivors, the initial trauma of the explosion was slowly, agonizingly compounded by the realization that the justice system itself was a compromised battlefield. The physical crater in the station waiting room had been cleared of debris and the structure rebuilt. But the institutional crater left by the complicity of the intelligence services and the P2 Masonic Lodge remained a gaping, festering wound. The courtroom proceedings that spanned decades were less a linear progression toward a definitive verdict and more a complex adversarial navigation through a dense fog of retracted testimonies, classified documents, and sudden, inexplicable amnesias from key state witnesses. It was a war of attrition designed to exhaust the moral and emotional reserves of those demanding accountability. Before we examine the final, controversial verdicts handed down to the neo-fascist executioners and analyze the enduring, haunting legacy of the untouchable architects who orchestrated the slaughter from the shadows, ensure your clearance to this archive is active. Subscribe to the ItaliaNoir channel and leave a like on this dossier. Your support is the vital instrument that allows us to expose the hidden architecture of these clandestine crimes and bring forgotten truths into the light. Let us step back into the labyrinth. The trial of Valerio Fioravanti and Francesca Mambro, the prominent figures of the armed revolutionary nuclei, identified as the material executors of the bombing, was a polarizing spectacle that captivated and divided the Italian public. The prosecution meticulously built a case entirely reliant on a complex web of circumstantial evidence, informant testimonies, and the undeniable logistical connections between the neo-fascist underground and the military-grade explosives used in the attack. The defense, however, aggressively exploited the glaring inconsistencies generated by the state's own prior misdirections. Fioravanti and Mambro, hardened ideological militants who readily admitted to a string of targeted political assassinations, vehemently and consistently denied their involvement in the indiscriminate slaughter at the railway station. They argued, with a chilling sociopathic logic, that mass civilian casualties contradicted their specific doctrine of revolutionary warfare. Their defense hinged on the assertion that they were convenient, radical scapegoats sacrificed by the deep state to protect the true institutional orchestrators of the massacre. Despite the intense scrutiny of their defense and the pervasive atmosphere of institutional sabotage, the judicial machinery slowly ground toward a resolution. The prosecution's narrative, though battered by the orchestrated cover-ups, ultimately convinced the judiciary. The physical presence of the accused in Bologna on the day of the attack, combined with their access to the specific explosive compounds and their deep integration within the subversive right-wing networks, formed an insurmountable barrier to their acquittals. In 1988, following years of agonizing legal maneuvering, the court delivered its verdict. Fioravanti and Mambro were found guilty of the massacre and sentenced to multiple terms of life imprisonment. It was a monumental legal victory, a formal condemnation of the neo-fascist terror apparatus that had drenched the years of lead in blood. Yet the pronouncement of the sentence in the crowded, tense courtroom did not bring the expected catharsis to the families of the victims. The conviction of the foot soldiers did not answer the fundamental, terrifying question that had haunted the investigation since August 2nd, 1980. Who gave the order? The true horror of Bologna was not merely the ideological fanaticism of the bombers. It was the chilling realization that the attack was a calculated instrument of the strategy of tension, a geopolitical doctrine requiring massive financial resources, sophisticated logistical planning, and high-level institutional protection. The magistrates, having successfully prosecuted the individuals who physically transported the deadly suitcase, found themselves staring at a reinforced, impenetrable wall when they attempted to follow the chain of command upward. The mandanti, the political and intelligence architects who conceptualized the massacre to destabilize the Democratic Republic, remained cloaked in the absolute immunity of state secrecy. The pursuit of these phantom architects became the defining mission of the Association of the Families of the Victims of the Bologna Massacre. Formed in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the explosion, this organization transformed profound personal grief into a relentless, sophisticated campaign for transparency. They became the uncompromising moral compass of the nation, refusing to accept the convenient narrative that the bombing was solely the work of isolated, radicalized extremists. They staged massive public demonstrations, meticulously analyzed thousands of pages of declassified documents, and relentlessly pressured the political establishment to expose the complicity of the military intelligence services and the P2 Lodge. Their unwavering demand was simple, yet seemingly impossible to achieve: the complete, unredacted truth regarding the institutional involvement in the slaughter of their loved ones. Their persistence yielded significant, albeit partial, victories over the decades. The judicial system, forced into action by the tireless advocacy of the Victims Association, eventually recognized and prosecuted several high-ranking intelligence officers and members of the P2 Lodge for their roles in the deliberate misdirection of the investigation. The Taranto train false flag operation and the systematic planting of fabricated evidence were formally recognized as acts of high treason against the state. The convictions of these institutional figures confirmed what the families had suspected from the very beginning. The Italian deep state was not merely incompetent in preventing the massacre. Segments of it were actively complicit in protecting the perpetrators and manipulating the public narrative to serve a reactionary, anti-democratic agenda. However, the ultimate identification and prosecution of the supreme mandanti, the individuals who provided the operational mandate and the financial backing for the bombing, remained agonizingly out of reach. The passage of time proved to be the most effective weapon of the conspirators. Witnesses died, Classified archives were purged or accidentally destroyed, and the political landscape of Italy evolved, pushing the urgency of the Bologna investigation further into the historical margins. The magistrates, despite their dedication, were continually thwarted by the absolute limits of judicial power when confronted by the entrenched, self-preserving mechanisms of the national security apparatus. The masterminds of the massacre, the men who coldly calculated the political utility of 85 civilian deaths, likely lived out their lives in comfortable, affluent impunity, entirely shielded from the consequences of their monstrous ambition. The legacy of the Bologna massacre is an enduring, complex scar on the collective conscience of Italy. It is a stark, terrifying reminder of the absolute vulnerability of ordinary citizens when the institutions designed to protect them are corrupted by clandestine agendas. The waiting room of the Central Station, though physically rebuilt, remains a sacred space of remembrance, a focal point for the annual commemorations that draw thousands of people, demanding that the memory of the victims is never compromised by the passage of time. The clock on the main facade, permanently frozen at 10:25, is not just a monument to the moment of detonation. It is a symbol of an ongoing, unresolved demand for absolute justice. As we close this dossier, the profound, unsettling reality of August 2nd, 1980, remains illuminated not by a definitive judicial conclusion, but by the relentless, unbreakable spirit of the victims' families. They prove that while the deep state possesses the power to orchestrate terror and manipulate truth, it cannot permanently extinguish the human demand for accountability. The strategy of tension failed to break the democratic resolve of the Italian people. The true victory of Bologna does not reside in the sterile pronouncements of the courtroom, but in the unwavering refusal of a city and a nation to be silenced by the shadows. The explosion shattered the station, but it forged an enduring, vigilant awareness that the pursuit of truth is a perpetual, necessary struggle against the darkness of institutional complicity. The archive remains open, and the hands of the clock, though frozen, continue to bear witness.